Range is hot. Shooters stand by. The voice, amplified by a cheap loudspeaker, was thin and reedy, devoid of the authority it tried to project. It belonged to Kyle, a man barely 25, whose tactical vest was still stiff with newness, and whose Oakley sunglasses seemed permanently affixed to his face, even indoors. He strutted behind the firing line, his partner Brent flanking him, both men radiating the unearned confidence of youth given a sliver of power. Their eyes scanned the line of shooters, mostly eager hobbyists and security guards needing their annual certification, and settled, with predictable disdain, on the old man in lane 4. He stood with a quiet stillness that they mistook for frailty, his posture relaxed but not slumped, his hands resting on the worn wooden grips of a vintage Colt 1911 that looked like it had been pulled from a museum. His clothes were simple, faded jeans, a plain flannel shirt, and a worn leather belt. He was an anachronism in this world of polymer frames, red dot sights, and aggressive marketing. "Hey, Grandpa." Kyle's voice crackled, singling him out. "You sure you're in the right place? The bingo hall is down the street." A few of the younger shooters snickered. The old man didn't react. His eyes, a pale and watery blue, remained fixed downrange, his expression unreadable. He had heard variations of that line for 20 years. It no longer registered as an insult, merely as noise, like the buzz of a fly. Brent stepped forward, pointing a thumb, wrapped in a tactical glove, at the ancient firearm. "And what is that thing? You planning on fighting the Kaiser? We have standards here, old-timer." "That relic is a safety liability." The old man finally shifted his gaze, not to Brent's face, but to the gloved hand pointing at his weapon. His voice, when it came, was soft but carried a strange weight, like gravel worn smooth by a river. "It works," he said. Just 2 words, offered without emotion or defense. This simple statement seemed to enrage the instructors more than any argument could have. It was a dismissal, a quiet refusal to engage with their performance of authority. Kyle's jaw tightened. "We'll be the judge of that. For now, try to keep up. We're running drills, not taking a nap." He clapped his hands together, a sharp, theatrical sound. "Listen up, people. Let's see what you've got." The old man, Arthur, simply turned his attention back to his lane, his fingers methodically checking the magazine, his movements slow, deliberate, and imbued with a reverence the young men couldn't possibly comprehend. The safety briefing was an exercise in condescension. Kyle paced before the line of shooters, delivering a speech he had clearly memorized from a manual, peppering it with his own brand of tactical jargon meant to impress and intimidate. When he reached Arthur's lane, he paused, making a show of inspecting the old man's stance. "Whoa there, Pops. What is this? You need to square up to your target. Aggressive forward lean. Get your weight on the balls of your feet." Like this, he demonstrated a posture straight out of a YouTube tutorial, all sharp angles and tense muscles. Arthur remained as he was, feet shoulder-width apart, a slight bend in his knees, his body a study in relaxed readiness. It was a classic Weaver stance, old school and fluid, a posture that conserved energy and allowed for a stable, natural point of aim. It was a fossil to men like Kyle, who only knew the modern isosceles taught in weekend courses. "Are you deaf?" Brent chimed in, his voice dripping with impatience. "The instructor is giving you a correction." Arthur's eyes flickered toward them. He made a minuscule adjustment, a slight shift of his left foot, a token gesture of compliance that was, in its subtlety, another form of defiance. He did not speak. His silence was a wall, thick and impenetrable, against which their arrogance crashed and dissipated. It infuriated them. They were used to deference, to the nervous eagerness of novices who hung on their every word. This old man, with his quiet dignity and his ancient pistol, was an affront to their self-proclaimed expertise. The other shooters watched the exchange, a mix of amusement and discomfort on their faces. A few of the younger ones, enamored with the instructor's tactical gear and aggressive confidence, smirked in solidarity. But some of the older participants shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the quiet cruelty of the display. They saw a grandfather being bullied by boys who had mistaken a uniform for honor. The air in the range grew thick with a tension that had nothing to do with the impending gunfire. It was the ancient, ugly friction between loud authority and quiet strength. Kyle, sensing he was losing the power dynamic, finally moved on, but not before delivering a parting shot. Fine, do it your way. But when you fail this qualification, don't say, I didn't try to help you. The first drill was simple. A controlled pair, 2 shots to the center mass of a paper silhouette target from 10 yards. The command was given, and the range erupted in a cacophony of sharp reports. Polymer pistols cycled with a snappy, plastic clatter. Arthur was the last to raise his weapon. There was no rush, no jerky movement. The old 1911 came up in a smooth, practiced arc, as if it were an extension of his arm. He paused for a fraction of a second, his body settling into the motion. Pop, pop. The sound of his pistol was deeper, throatier than the others, a classic .45 ACP roar. 2 holes appeared on the target, perfectly centered and so close together they nearly touched. It was a flawless execution, but it was done without flair. There was no tactical flourish, no aggressive speed. It was pure economy of motion, and for that, the instructors saw only weakness. Too slow, Grandpa, Kyle shouted over the din, striding over to inspect the target. He glanced at the tight grouping, and for a moment, his smug expression faltered. But he recovered quickly. Okay, so you can hit a stationary target eventually. But in a real-world scenario, you'd be dead before you even got your museum piece out of its holster. He turned to the rest of the class. See that, people? That's called tombstone accuracy. He's accurate, sure, but he's dead. Speed is security. Hesitation will get you killed. Arthur ignored him, his focus already on his weapon. He brought the pistol down, his finger moving off the trigger with instinctual discipline. He ejected the magazine, not by letting it drop to the floor in a show of tactical reloading, but by catching it in his palm. He placed the half-empty magazine carefully on the small shelf in his booth before reaching for a fresh one. Every action was precise, methodical, and imbued with a sense of profound respect for the tool in his hands. Brent swaggered over, shaking his head in theatrical disbelief. What are you doing? Drop the mag. Reload. We're running a drill here, not having a tea party. You're holding up the line, but Arthur wasn't holding up the line. He was ready. He had simply followed a sequence of actions ingrained in him over decades, a process born not from competition rules, but from the unforgiving reality of a battlefield where a dropped magazine was a lost resource and a jammed weapon was a death sentence. He looked at Brent, his pale eyes holding a flicker of something ancient and weary, and said nothing. He simply waited for the next command, his silence a louder rebuke than any curse. The sharp, metallic clack of the slide locking back on an empty chamber echoed in Arthur's mind, but the sound was different. It wasn't the clean, hollow sound of the indoor range. It was heavier, muffled by dense, humid air thick with the smell of rotting vegetation and cordite. For a heartbeat, the sterile white walls of the shooting booth dissolved into a curtain of triple canopy jungle, slick with a constant, warm drizzle. The concrete floor became thick, sucking mud that pulled at his boots. The fluorescent lights overhead were replaced by a sliver of moon, barely visible through the suffocating darkness of a night in the Mekong Delta. He wasn't Arthur, the old man. He was Ghost, point man for a 6-man SEAL team, his face painted in camouflage stripes, his body aching under the weight of his gear, the cold steel of his 1911 a familiar comfort in his hand. He could feel the phantom weight of the PRC 77 radio on his back, hear the hushed whispers of his teammates in his earpiece, a language of clicks and code words. The paper silhouette downrange was no longer paper. It was a shadow in the foliage, a fleeting movement that could be a tiger or a Viet Cong soldier. The command to fire wasn't from a cocky instructor. It was the silent pressure of his fire team leader's hand on his shoulder, a signal to engage. The 2 shots he had just fired were not for a score. They were for survival, for the man to his left and the man to his right. The memory was visceral but fleeting, a ghost of sensation that vanished as quickly as it came. He blinked, and the jungle receded. The sterile range snapped back into focus, jarringly bright and loud. The smell of burnt powder was clean here, chemical, not the acrid, organic scent of battle. He looked at the smug faces of Kyle and Brent, their clean uniforms and self-important swagger, and felt a profound sense of dislocation. They were playing a game, a loud, safe pantomime of a reality they could never comprehend. They taught rules for a world of clean lines and predictable outcomes. He had come from a world where there were no rules, only consequences. His deliberate movements, his careful handling of his weapon, his silent vigilance. These were not the quirks of an old man. They were the sacred rituals of a survivor. From a small observation window behind the firing line, a man named David watched the unfolding drama with a growing sense of unease. A former Marine sergeant who now worked a quiet logistics job at the nearby naval base. He was only here to sign off on some paperwork. He had been about to leave when the confrontation between the instructors and the old man caught his attention. At first, he felt a familiar annoyance at the young instructor's arrogance. But as he watched the old man, something else began to stir, a deep, instinctual recognition. He wasn't looking at the flannel shirt or the wrinkled face. He was looking at the details. He saw the way Arthur's head was on a constant, subtle swivel, his eyes never truly resting on one spot for long, a classic sign of hypervigilance ingrained by years in hostile environments. He saw the economy of motion, recognizing it not as the slowness of age, but as the brutal efficiency of someone who had operated where wasted energy meant death. Then he saw the tattoo. It was on the inside of Arthur's right wrist, visible for just a second as he reloaded. It was so faded it was barely more than a bluish-gray smudge on his weathered skin. But David had spent enough time around Navy old-timers to know exactly what it was, the old-style underwater demolition team trident, with the flintlock pistol and the eagle. This was the insignia of the frogmen, the precursors to the SEALs, the legends of World War II and Korea. This man wasn't just a veteran. He was a piece of foundational history. And then David looked closer at the pistol. The 1911. It was worn, the bluing gone from the high points, but it was immaculately clean. The grips were dark wood, worn smooth by a single hand over thousands of hours. It wasn't a relic, it was a part of him. A cold fury began to build in David's chest. He was watching two children mock a god of war. He slipped out of the observation room, his heart pounding with a righteous anger. He pulled out his phone, his fingers flying across the screen. He had a number, a direct line to a man who would understand, a man who owed David a favor. He called the personal cell of the Fleet Master Chief for the entire Pacific Fleet. "Master Chief, it's Sergeant Miller," he said, his voice low and urgent. "You're not going to believe what I'm seeing down here at the civilian range off base." He quickly explained the situation, describing the old man, the tattoo, and the relentless disrespect. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then a voice like cold steel said, "Stay there. I'm making a call. Help is on the way." On the range, Kyle and Brent had reached the end of their patience. Arthur's quiet defiance, his refusal to be intimidated, had become a personal challenge to their authority. His silent competence was a constant, unspoken refutation of their loud expertise. They needed to reassert control, and the old man was going to be their example. During the next drill, a timed reload and target transition, Arthur performed with the same unhurried precision. He wasn't the fastest, but his shots were perfect, and his reload, while not a flashy, mag-dropping affair, was smooth and fumble-free. It was this lack of theatricality that gave them their opening. "That's it. Time," Kyle yelled, stepping onto the firing line and raising his hand. "We're calling this. Lane 4. You're done for the day." Arthur lowered his pistol, his expression unchanged. "I haven't completed the qualification," he stated simply. "Oh, you've completed it. All right," Brent sneered, walking up beside Kyle. "You've failed. Your movements are too slow to be considered effective, and frankly, that antique firearm is a safety hazard. We can't, in good conscience, certify you." The accusation was absurd. The 1911 was one of the most reliable pistol designs in history, and Arthur's was a perfect example of a well-maintained weapon. His performance, while not flashy, was far from a failure. This was no longer about standards. It was a pure, vindictive abuse of power. "Pack your gear and go," Kyle commanded, pointing toward the exit. "We'll be notifying the state that your permit is being reviewed for revocation due to unsafe practices." The public humiliation was now complete. In front of a dozen other people, they were not just failing him. They were stripping him of his right to carry a firearm, branding him as unsafe and incompetent. Arthur stood his ground, his gaze steady. "There's nothing unsafe about my practices or my weapon. We're the certified instructors here, old man. We decide what's safe," Brent said, taking a step closer. He reached out and placed a hand on Arthur's shoulder, intending to physically escort him from the line. "Now, let's go." The show's over. The moment Brent's hand touched him, the atmosphere on the range shifted. It was a line crossed, a final, unforgivable act of disrespect. Arthur didn't flinch, but a profound stillness settled over him, the calm at the center of a hurricane. Just as Brent began to apply pressure to Arthur's shoulder, a sound from outside sliced through the rhythmic pop of gunfire from the adjacent ranges. It was the piercing, authoritative wail of a siren, growing rapidly closer. Everyone on the range paused, turning their heads toward the entrance. Through the large plate glass windows, they saw not a police car or an ambulance, but a sleek, black sedan, followed by another, both flying small, four-starred flags from their front fenders. The cars bore official government plates and moved with a purpose that commanded attention. They swept into the parking lot and screeched to a halt directly in front of the main entrance, a flagrant violation of the fire lane rules that Kyle and Brent enforced with religious zeal. The back door of the lead car opened, and a figure emerged. The entire facility seemed to hold its breath. It was a United States Navy Admiral in full-dress whites, the uniform immaculate and blindingly bright under the fluorescent lights. 4 silver stars glittered on each of his shoulder boards, signifying his rank as one of the highest-ranking military officers in the world. A cascade of colorful ribbons adorned his chest, a silent testament to a lifetime of service and valor. He was flanked by 2 Marine guards in dress blues, their faces set like stone. The Admiral stood for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the building before him, his posture exuding an aura of absolute and unquestionable command. He moved toward the entrance, his polished shoes clicking on the asphalt with a rhythmic, menacing cadence. The automatic doors slid open, and he strode into the lobby, his eyes already scanning the interior, searching. Kyle and Brent froze, their hands still on Arthur. Confusion warred with a sudden, sickening jolt of fear on their faces. They were low-level instructors at a civilian range. A 4-star admiral was so far outside their context, it was like a creature from another dimension had just walked into their world. They let go of Arthur as if he were red-hot iron, their bravado vanishing in an instant, replaced by the terrified bewilderment of children caught in a serious transgression. The Admiral's eyes, the color of a stormy sea, swept past the cowering instructors as if they were invisible. He ignored the stunned facility manager who was now scurrying out of his office, his face pale and slack-jawed. The Admiral's gaze locked onto the old man in the flannel shirt standing in lane 4. And then he began to walk. He moved with a long, determined stride, his entourage of 2 Marines falling into step behind him. The sound of his dress shoes crunching on scattered brass casings was the only sound in the now silent building. Every other shooter stood like a statue, weapons lowered, eyes wide. The Admiral did not slow until he was 3 feet in front of Arthur. He stopped, drew himself up to his full height, and in the sudden, sacred silence of the gun range, he executed a salute. It was not a casual gesture. It was a work of art, a movement of such precision and sharp formality that it seemed to cut the air. His hand sliced up to his brow, his arm ramrod straight, his posture a living embodiment of military respect. And he held it, his gaze locked on the old man's face. Then, his voice, clear and powerful, resonated through the cavernous space. "Master Chief Petty Officer Thorne," he said, the formal title striking the air like a hammer blow. "It is an absolute honor, sir." The title, Master Chief Petty Officer, hung in the air, electric with meaning. It was the highest enlisted rank, a position of near-mythical reverence. But it was the Admiral's use of the word sir, a term of respect an officer is not required to use for an enlisted man. That was the true thunderclap. It inverted the entire power structure of the universe as Kyle and Brent knew it. The Admiral slowly lowered his hand and finally, for the first time, acknowledged the 2 young instructors. His gaze, now arctic cold, fell upon them. His voice dropped to a low, controlled fury that was more terrifying than any shout. "I was informed," he began, his words deliberate and heavy, "that 2 civilian contractors were disrespecting a living legend. Explain to me, in very small words, what, precisely, you think you are doing." Kyle and Brent stood paralyzed, their faces ashen. They opened their mouths, but no sound came out. They were utterly, comprehensively broken. The Admiral let the silence hang for a long, brutal moment, allowing the full weight of their transgression to crush them. Then, he began the lesson. His voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of history, a formal, damning indictment delivered with the precision of a surgeon. You men stand here in your $500 pants and your mail-order certifications, and you presume to judge this man. He took a step closer, his eyes boring into Kyle's. This man is Master Chief Arthur Thorne. He is not just a veteran. He is a plank owner of United States Naval Special Warfare Development Group. Before that, he was a founding member of SEAL Team 2. Does that mean anything to you? Or are you too busy watching action movies to have ever read a history book? The instructors could only stare, their ignorance a gaping wound. The Admiral gestured toward Arthur's unhurried, methodical movements. You called him slow. What you call slowness, Master Chief Thorne called operational discipline. It's the discipline that kept his six-man team alive for 72 hours straight in the Iron Triangle, surrounded by an entire NVA battalion. He taught the very principles of tactical movement and fire control that have been watered down and bastardized into the nonsense you spout here. He then pointed a single, accusatory finger at the old 1911 resting on the booth shelf. You called his weapon a relic, a liability. That pistol was presented to him in 1968 by Lieutenant Commander Richard Marcinko after a mission so secret it is still classified to this day. That weapon has saved the lives of American servicemen in places your little minds cannot even imagine. It has earned more honor than you two will ever know. The Admiral's voice grew harder, each word a hammer blow of truth. This man wears no medals. But I know for a fact that in a safe at Naval Special Warfare Command, there is a box with his name on it. Inside that box is a Navy Cross, 2 silver stars, and 5 bronze stars, all with the Combat V for Valor. He is a ghost. A legend. He is the man who our new operators study, the quiet professional upon whose sacrifice this entire community was built. And you put your hands on him. He let that final accusation settle, a death sentence for their careers and their pride. The Admiral turned from the shattered instructors to the facility manager, who was now trembling visibly. Your facility's government contracts are hereby suspended, pending a full review of your instructor vetting process. These 2 men, he said, gesturing dismissively at Kyle and Brent, will have their instructor certifications permanently revoked. They will never again work on any federal, state, or local contract. I will see to it personally. They are to be removed from these premises. Now, the manager, stammering apologies, immediately motioned for his own security staff to escort the 2 disgraced young men away. They went without a word, their faces masks of pure, horrified shame, their swagger gone, leaving only the empty shell of their arrogance behind. The Admiral watched them go, his expression implacable. Then, he turned back to Arthur, and the fury in his eyes was replaced by a look of profound, almost reverent respect. Master Chief, he said, his voice softening, I apologize for this circus. The range is yours. Please, finish your qualification. I will wait. Arthur looked at the Admiral, a long, silent moment passing between the 2 men. It was a look that communicated decades of shared understanding, of service and sacrifice. Then, Arthur turned his head slightly and looked toward the exit, where Kyle and Brent were being led away. For the first time, a flicker of something other than stoicism crossed his face. Not anger, but a deep, weary sadness. He took a slow breath and spoke, his voice quiet, but carrying across the silent range to the ears of the humbled young men. The first lesson of any warrior, he said, his words a quiet benediction, is humility. You never know whose ghost you're standing beside. He then turned back to his lane, his movements once again fluid and deliberate. He picked up a fresh magazine, seated it in his 1911 with a solid, definitive click, and raised the pistol. He flawlessly completed the remainder of the qualification course, each shot a perfect, ringing punctuation mark on the day's lesson. When he was finished, he carefully unloaded and